What's up, family? Thank you for tuning in to the Dream Nation podcast. My name is Casanova. I'll be your host, and I'm excited to be bringing to you entrepreneurs, thought leaders, and trailblazers from around the world. Stay locked in with us because we're about to go on a journey that will change your life. What's up, Dream Builder? We are back again with another episode, and I'm excited to bring this to you today because, of course, right now, we all have a dream, but we're struggling to figure out a lot of the times, how do we turn that dream into a reality? And of course, that's the reason why we have this show. And I think today's guest on the show, my brother, Mr. Solo Ceesay, is going to be able to help us in turning this dream into a reality, especially if it's focused around business. So without further ado, please help me in welcoming Solo to the show. Solo, you want to go ahead and say what's up to Dream Nation?
What's up, everybody? Appreciate you guys for having me. Appreciate it.
Oh,
really excited to be here.
absolutely. We're excited to have you on. So let's go ahead and hop right into it. I mean, you have been a part of technology, it seems like, for a couple years now. But let me ask, if we could take it back, when the research that I did and what my team found is that you started off and you were playing sports, you played football at Penn, right? You were a lineman there. Where did business come from for you?
Yeah, so I mean, I think I've always had an entrepreneurial mindset. So I grew up West African in the United States, with my parents coming from Senegal and Gambia. I think just in that realm, you either could be one of three things: a doctor, a lawyer, or a businessman. So like my thing was, when I was 6 years old, my dad told me, you know what, you got to figure out what you want to be because that's how African parents are. And so business was kind of something that was always in my DNA, but kind of more professionally when it came to going to Penn. And playing Division I football, that was great. But, at a school like Penn and in the Ivy League, they always, push for academic excellence as well as being, strong Division I athletes. And so a lot of my teammates, ended up going down the path of working on Wall Street. And so when I was looking at figuring out what I wanted to do long term or like the different types of careers that I might think about pursuing, I created a network of stakeholders, including, mentors, people that were older than me, people in the Penn ecosystem, as well as my teammates. That really helped educate me on something that I knew nothing about. I came from the Midwest, grew up in St. Louis. We don't have Wall Street out there. So business really came about, after the fact that, it was deep rooted in my DNA and kind of, where I always wanted to end up. But the educational process was something that was definitely, a long period of time that, had a lot of different touch points along the way. And so my teammates, they went to New York for one summer. They came back saying it was dope, it was sick. The lights, the fast New York City, the air, the fresh smell of the air and stuff like that. And so I got really excited. And so that's kind of how I fell into it.
Got it. That's what's up. So you decide to listen, because I got a couple of my best friends that are from, at least their parents are from Nigeria. They're of African descent, and we know that especially the parents and the grandparents, they have the ways that they do things. And a lot of times, just like you said, like you're going to be a doctor, you're going to be something academically. For you, like, was sports always your thing? Did your parents want you to do sports? Were they not so much?
Oh my God. Absolutely not. My parents are, especially football too, because my dad would always be like, I don't understand why you guys would put on that stuff and just go hit each other. Like, that makes no sense to me. So my dad was really not messing with it for the longest. I actually picked up football at the age of like 16. So I didn't play sports at all. I was in the books, in the kitchen, mama's boy, little chubby African kid that was just really in the studies. When I moved to St. Louis, I actually grew up in Kansas prior to moving to St. Louis, and I went to a high school where you were forced to play sports because I wanted to make sure that they produced well-rounded students. And so I, had the personality that if I were going to do something, I was going to do it to my best of my abilities. Football was the thing that I chose. And so in that, like, that's kind of how I ended up playing sports, but I got it, much later on. I definitely benefited from some of the intangibles that come with, like, becoming a division athlete. Obviously you have a certain like size profile, height, et cetera. But, outside of that, it was something that I definitely fell into a lot later. But I think my competitive, nature that's inherent to like who I am, made me want to stick with it and do it to the best of my abilities.
Yeah, no, and definitely that translates a lot to business as well, right? When you can persevere, you can be resilient, you're going to go through a lot of adversity, especially when you're in a startup world, which you've got into. And that's kind of a great segue, which I wanted to, so you get out, you then go on Wall Street, is that right? You're like a data analyst?
I was an investment banker, for
Investment banker.
couple of years. For 4 years, investment banking.
Got it. And so why did you decide to get out?
I think for me, it became one of those days where I showed up to work and it was no longer, that super exciting job that I, aspired to have back when I was in college and I first found out about it. And I'm just a big proponent of like, you want to make sure that what you're spending most of your time doing, you're enjoying, right? Like your career and something like that doesn't have to be something that's a means to an end. Like I think, that's the biggest blessing that, my parents, the biggest sacrifices that they made is so that I could look at the world that way because it wasn't always the case, for them. A job didn't always have to be synonymous with something that you're like super, super excited or pleased to be doing. It was a means to an end. At least that's what it was for them. But like they worked so hard for me to be able to kind of, look at the world a bit differently. And so I definitely say that from a certain level of privilege. But also at the same time, I think for me, there were more creative ways to apply the things that I learned, whether it was stuff that I learned on the field, whether it was stuff that I learned in the classroom at Wharton, whether it was stuff I learned there at the investment bank. I think my mind is just a little bit more creative than the position or role that I was currently in allowed me to be. And so that's kind of when I realized, okay, like, I looked around to my left, I looked to my right, and I was like, do I really want to be, like these people that are around me? Do I aspire to have their lives? And the answer was no. And so that's when I realized, okay, like I got to figure out something else. And so that's kind of when the dreaming started.
Got it. And so you started to dream. Was your dad in business? Was your mom in business? Because now it goes from just having a good job, right? And one of the more prestigious jobs when you tell somebody, hey, I'm an investment banker, I work on Wall Street, the world is like, oh, like, he's making big money. But what was your parents like when you say, hey, I don't think this is what I want to do anymore. I think I want to go pursue my own dream.
Yeah, I mean, I think for them, my parents have always been super supportive, quite funny enough. Like a lot of times, just no matter who you are, you have parents that may not be as supportive because they think, not because they don't want to be, but because they want what's best for you and what they think is best for you is what they think, right? Like a lot of times that is the case. But my parents are definitely, proud of and definitely a believer in my ability to do, what it is that I thought was best for me. And like they that was good enough for them. So I think for them, they were really supportive about it. Obviously they asked me a ton of questions, right? So like once you had a decent idea and you feel like you have something that makes sense to at least them, they kind of let you run with it, right? Like if I told them, something that didn't make sense to them, they would probably have told me straight up, yeah, this, we're all for you leaving this job, but this is not the reason or opportunity to do that, or the timing, right? And so I think from that perspective, that was great. And so like I think for them, they definitely were, really supportive and excited. And I told them it was kind of the next step, right? Like I didn't ever really think I would be a lifer, right, in finance, but I knew that I wanted to get a certain skill set, go through a certain level of trial and tribulation in order to, build the resilience to ultimately do something like this, right? Like that's what Wall Street taught me. It taught me how to be resilient, taught me how to be resourceful. And it honestly just taught me how to connect with people in order to, achieve a common goal.
That's what's up, man. So walk us through the first 60 days after you decide, hey, this is no longer what I want to do. Did you already have that next plan in place? Like, was it already in
Yeah.
motion? So you had already started it before you left, or what did that look like?
Correct. Correct. Like, I mean, and that's actually a good point too, because as an investment banker, you're working 90, sometimes 100-hour weeks. So like, your personal time is in your leisure time is super valuable. But I spent a lot of my leisure time in on Galaxy and the birth of what it is now and what it hopes to be, and a lot of it is thanks to the pandemic. Like to be able to be at home and like be able to get those time and those valuable minutes back was super additive to ultimately what the vision ended up being for Galaxy. So I was dreaming. I was working with my co-founder Spencer Dinwiddie. He's the other co-founder of Galaxy. Shout out to Spencer. He just signed a nice deal with the Washington Wizards.
Right.
So we're really excited about him for there. But, it was kind of a lot of those different conversations that I had, in my free time that really, was the launch pad for, what we ultimately would build. But, it was something that required a ton of time and a ton of sacrifice. But I'm just glad that, you're starting to see the benefits of it. I saw the benefits of it immediately, but it's always nice to get validation, from, media outlets or, even just people knowing about your idea. I think it's the coolest thing in the world.
Yeah, no, I would 100% agree. So talk us through for anybody that's hearing about Galaxy for the first time. You mentioned about the vision. It's cool to now see it becoming a reality and you're reaping the fruits of its labor for all the sacrifice and hard work that you've put in. where did this dream come from? Like, where did Galaxy come from?
Yeah, so I think it came from, Spencer and myself really looking to apply, the knowledge and expertise that we had in our respective fields to a life that we know a lot about, right? So like when you think about the entertainment industry at large, the ways in which money flows through that ecosystem, a lot of times is not at the benefit to the creators or the influencers or the public figures themselves, right? Like a lot of times they end up, in very inequitable situations. And so what we thought about was a different way to allow creators to monetize themselves in a way that they deserve to be monetized, allow them to take control back out of the system, or think about it as an analog to the idea of decentralization and crypto and blockchain in general. The whole ethos around it is taking the power from one specific person or entity and disseminating it amongst the community, right? And so in this case, it's taking the power from these big centralized entities and giving it into the power of the creators and the artists and all of those people. And so what we did is we actually tokenized Spencer's NBA contract. So basically we securitized it, and I was previously a securitization investment banker. That was my focus. And we took it and applied it to the entertainment industry. And essentially what we did is we took his, NBA contract, which pays you a certain amount of money over time, over the next, the duration of the contract, brought all those cash flows to time zero. So it's kind of like an asset-based loan or, cash advance, however you want to think about it. And then you obviously pay, a certain amount of interest on it. But if you're able to finance yourself at a rate that makes sense, there's definitely, a lot of incentives for you why you would want to do that, right? If you think about the entertainment industry at large, people want to finance their lifestyles. Sometimes they're taking hard money loans and they're paying 20-30% interest, right? But if the capital markets are willing to lend to you at 4, 5, 3%, whatever it is, that's a winning trade every single time. And so that was kind of the idea of applying, financial principles that I learned on Wall Street to the entertainment industry. But we also realized that, the idea of monetization is much more than that. And so the birth of Galaxy came off of that as a way that people recognize that, maybe monetizing your contract is tough, or maybe monetizing music royalties is tough right now for people to understand. But what people really know is monetizing their likeness, right? People know monetizing their time. So when you think about the rise of platforms like Cameo, Patreon, these creator platforms, you've seen that there have been creators that have been able to make a lot of money out of connecting with their fans in more intimate experiences, because that's what the fans want. And so that's when the birth of Galaxy, as it currently is structured, came to place. And we're a one-stop shop for creators to monetize themselves. The same place that you go to get a video call with an influencer like we are having right now should be the same place that you go to buy their exclusive content. And then obviously the blockchain component of it, you should be able to buy NFTs and digital collectibles because that's where the market's going. And so that's kind of the whole story and the genesis of, how we get from, end of 2018 to now.
Wow. No, it's so fascinating. So much I want to break down. So it sounds like you already had a relationship with Spencer prior, so you've known him for quite a bit.
Yeah, Spencer's a family friend of ours. I think, in this ecosystem, we are all athletes. Like that's the beauty of our company is that we all kind of understand this target demographic of what an entertainer is. Because a lot of times, in a lot of ways we kind of are, right? Like we're tangential or, we are them. So yeah, he's been the family for a long time.
Got it. And the reason why I asked that is because I'm curious to know, did you approach him on this? Did he approach you and say, hey, I just got a contract. I see you've been doing some things in the investment world. What did that look like? And I promise there's a reason why I'm asking this question.
No, for sure. No, I think, Spencer is, he's a very forward-thinking guy. So he was kind of thinking about ways in which that he could, really democratize his presence as a platform because he's an influencer himself, right? And so it was kind of through that, and he was thinking about, well, what if I did something like, my contract or something like that? And so really it was really kind of started like that, but then I was kind of like, okay, well, like this is how the legacy market works, right? Like this is how this stuff works in principle. These are the considerations you got to think about, right? Like you got to think about liquidity, right? Like you have to think about the fact that like a contract is a much more, a much smaller tranche than, something that would be a residential mortgage-backed bond that could be much, much larger, right? Like Fidelity doesn't want to buy that. BlackRock doesn't want to buy that, right? So you got to think about who's your target demographic and understanding that sort of nuance with it is kind of like what I brought to the table. But it very much so was like, him just being like, how can I be different? He's always been like that.
Got it. And the reason why I was asking is because I think that, Galaxy sounds like a really, really dope app, right? And it's definitely innovative, right? And it's going to help to revolutionize, just like you said, for a lot of entertainers. But for a lot of us, we have these types of ideas, and we maybe know a person or two of influence, whether they are a celebrity or, an athlete, or even if they're just somebody that's pretty wealthy because, obviously they got a lot of family money or something. But we don't know a lot
Yeah.
of the times how to approach. And just like you said, there's a lot of other things behind it. And if you didn't come from Wall Street, if you don't understand investment banking and securities and things like that, how do you get your message out there to that person to where they, one, would take you serious, but two, they would want to partner up with you?
Yeah, no, that's a great question. And so for us, that's kind of the whole idea of like, pivoting from like a purely securitization financial play to something that people understand. People understand social media. That's what we spend most of our time on. Unfortunately, in a lot of different ways, but we spend almost too much time on it. But like, in all seriousness, like, we spend a lot of time on that. And so, going to a, LeBron one day and be like, hey, I want to securitize your contract. Like, that's something that's like, we're not quite there yet, right? Like, the world doesn't think that way. But monetizing your time, like I said before, is what people recognize. And so for us, like, it's been very key building something that would be palatable, especially when you add the complexities that come with blockchain. It needs to be something that could be well received by the intended audience, right? If we wanted to build an app that was meant for traders of crypto and stuff like that, a lot of this explanation would be a lot of this would be self-explanatory. But I think from the idea of having a platform that is meant to touch different discovery audiences, and people haven't looked at this stuff before, it's insurmountably important to be able to have a platform that makes sense and can be received to them. And so that's hence the reason why we think about, we want to be mentioned in the conversation with, the Cameos, the Patreons of the world, but be the gateway product from that world into the world of 3.0, Web 3.0, where you have different possibilities.
Got it. No, that makes sense. And I know there's some people out there that's listening. I always love to make sure that we can, explain it, dumb it down as best as we can. And so for
Yeah.
somebody that's hearing about, securitize or blockchain or something like that, what's your easiest way to explain it, or how do you define it? If you're talking to, let's say you're talking to me and I've never heard of blockchain, I'm like, I don't really understand how this works. Explain it to me how you would explain it to someone else.
Yeah, I mean, I think the way that would make sense is like the fact that in the developed world mostly, and like in all the world right now, we've always leaned on the endorsement model, right? Like credibility of like an institution or being able to point to one person to be able to, cite, good faith is how we've lived our lives, right? So like when you go about a bank, right? Like you want to you want to wire money from one bank to another person, right? Like from your bank account to somebody else's bank account. There's a centralized entity in between that transaction that sends the money and validates that transaction, right? But what you're at the risk of is you need to be able to point to that guy and say, I trust that guy to not mess with this transaction, right? But the beauty of ethos of blockchain technology is that the community in aggregate is trying to be the ones that validate the transaction in aggregate, right? So you think about the idea of like going to a third world country where you can't necessarily, or the undeveloped world rather, and you may not necessarily be able to trust that centralized entity, right? But when you build a blockchain or you build a network where each computer is really trying to win that next transaction, that randomness is what allows you to be able to say that you can't point to that one person or that one person. And there's a lot of incentives to avoid fraud and things like that because everyone in the network will know you build a much safer, more secure network that is going to be a lot more seamless. And it's also a lot faster because of that, right? So I think the idea of it really is like the idea of, if you want to explain how Bitcoin's network works, it's very simple, right? In order to in order to validate the next transaction, a bunch of computers on a network, they're called nodes, they guess at a math equation. And whoever's able to solve the random math equation gets awarded that next transaction. So that randomness is what I'm pointing to before. You can't point to that person, you can't point to that person and say that they're the ones that did it. That's what makes the network secure. The more nodes that are doing it, the harder the math equation gets, the harder it is to validate transactions. There's no way that one person can control that network because there's tons of different computers. Whereas like, big banks, they can control the financial world as it currently stands. And so we're at the mercy of those different things.
Wow. No, I love it. I love the way that you explain that. So do you find as you are, because you obviously can't go to banks for like funding or things like that, because obviously you're trying to decentralize what they're doing, so you're kind of a competitor to them. So when you are going out, because we talked a little bit before air that you've been able to raise, or at least just one round, you were able to raise $7.5 million for a round of funding. How were you able to raise that money? Was that a lot of the playoff for you and your network, or was it? Would you say you got blessed because obviously being partnered up with Spencer and his credibility that he has?
Yeah, I would say that definitely helped with it, right? Like even the securitization itself as a proof of concept point that like there's something here was helpful to get the investment community behind us. But I think a lot of it has to do with the authenticity of our story, right? Like we're not two, middle-aged, white men in Silicon Valley with another idea, right? Like we're creating something that makes sense for people that we know directly. Like when we deal with these influencers, like Spencer and I are the ones recruiting to these influencers directly to our platform. Like we know them. So like when we have, people like Ezekiel or Matt James like joining the platform, I'm talking to them. I'm not talking to their agents. That's what kind of makes our business very unique in that way. And so I think that authenticity factor is what allowed people to be like, okay, like these guys are actually building something that they know intimately about, right? And then also when I think about, blockchain and stuff, you bring up a good point. Like the legacy financial world is going to have some aversions to the adoption of this technology, right? Because if you're a bank and you're like, oh crap, I won't be able to directly make money off of this transaction charging fees because it's direct peer to peer, that is a very big problem. But what we've seen a lot is that world is just it's something that's inevitable. The people want it, right? You've seen it in every single different example outside of blockchain, right? Like when you think about AMC and GameStop and like these hedge funds getting screwed over by individual retail investors that in aggregate are more powerful than these big entities. And like people realize that now, right? And so when you realize that we as a community are more powerful than any centralized entity, it's a very powerful message. And so I think because of that, like those legacy entities are like, okay, we got to find a way to get paid some way in this ecosystem, right? Like it's inevitable. It's coming. How do we get paid in it? So that's what we're starting to see a lot of. And then lastly, the investment community in the crypto side is massive at this point, right? Like, a lot of people made a ton of money off of their bets, way back then, off of Bitcoin, off of, Ethereum. And there's a lot of money in the space. And we got a lot of, investment interest from them too. So we got investors, from influencers themselves that were high net worth individuals that could afford it. The legacy, financial world and traditional VCs are like, this is a technology that's going to be here no matter what. We might as well get with it. And then on the crypto side, we had, a lot of people support our project from there as, one of the first crypto projects that, the average person might actually understand. Like people understand influencers, people understand social media, people understand, monetizing your time. So we were very blessed in that way to have the holistic, all the pieces together.
Yeah, no, I think that's a great explanation, and you broke it down for us. So I think somebody could definitely understand it. When you being in the investment banking world, and this is something that was new for me. You know a little bit about my story, right? But I mean, being as a young black man, and I think for a lot of people, regardless if you're black or whatever you are, but definitely if you're black, you don't understand the concept of leverage, right? It's always bootstrapping. It's always you got to use your own money. And I know this is how I kind
Yep.
of grew up. And so, but then what you find, or at least what I found, and maybe you've seen it to be different or seen it from a different perspective, is a lot of the times we don't know how to leverage other people's time, resources, and money. Right. And so in the investment banking world, was that drilled into you right away? Or like, how did you really start to understand the concept and the power of raising capital? Because a lot of people
Yeah.
don't. And I think that that's why their business never gets off of the ground. Would you say so?
Yeah, no, that is absolutely, that couldn't be truer. Like I think, even myself, like too, like, from growing up in an African household, we were always taught to not have debt. Like for the reason, like you don't ever want to be able to have somebody point to you and say, you owe me money, right? Like that's
Right.
just how my parents were, right? And I think that aspect of it is true, but the whole idea of capitalism in America is it's built on that, right? So like going back to the securitization example, there's so much, potential opportunity for every single aspect of it, right? Like if you're a person of interest and you signed a big contract, but you don't have money in your pocket now, but you want to finance your lifestyle in some way, shape, or form, there are far more efficient ways to go about having that, right? And so when you're able to finance yourself at an interest rate that makes sense, you could create massive wealth creation, right? Like if you make the right bets, right? And if the markets are efficient, which a lot of times they are, if you're going to originate something, if you're financing yourself at 2%, you got to find the private banker that can beat that, right? Like you can find a private banker that can beat that. And if, the power of compounding, we all know that, we've heard it, being able to bring things to time, now that time is worth something, right? And, on the opposite side of it too, is like when you start to open those opportunities for investment based off different structuring. So like, you have things like Reg A where you can have average people, in, retail, or like Reg CF and things like that. Reg CF, where you could have regular people investing in, different, types of investment opportunities. That might allow people to have access to different, different investments that they might not ordinarily have access to. So the idea of just like, the idea of, leverage and all of these different things, it benefits a lot of people, right? Because, as an accredited investor, you have the opportunities for those 100x, returns, but those aren't afforded to non-accredited investors. But, there are certain things that you can buy, as an unaccredited investor. But there's some other certain things, like if you could buy a publicly verifiable, like riskless asset, like a contract securitization, because it comes from the MBA where money's all guaranteed. There's a trade-off of, and massive wealth creation on both sides.
Man, it's so crazy. I'm fascinated by this. And the reason why I say is because I was actually just having a conversation with a buddy of mine. This is 2 weeks ago, because me being in real estate, obviously, it's a lot more comfortable to try to raise capital for a tangible asset like real estate. But when you're trying to raise capital for something that's more on the VC side, a business that's a vision, and maybe, what does that mindset have to be like? Because if you don't even have a prototype, or maybe you just have a prototype, but you don't have any sales or proof of, a concept from your clients, how do you get your mindset around, hey, I can still pitch people on this and raise capital?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. And, just for context, like I worked in a real estate tangential market as a securitization investment banker focusing on, residential mortgage-backed securities. So like and commercial mortgage-backed too. So I totally understand where you're coming from. And, you're absolutely right. Like that is the biggest hurdle that we ever faced, right? Like how do you get people to believe the vision? Like how do you believe that one day it makes sense for LeBron James to be publicly listed? Right? Like, how do you get the world of like being able to tokenize a person? That sounds crazy, right? Like, sounds crazy. I could buy into this person. Like, what does that even mean, right? Like, it doesn't make sense. And so I think for us, what was super beneficial is like, I got to just give it to my team. Like, I have the best team that I could possibly have, internal and external. Like, we have great advisory board. We all together were able to paint a vision that was able to, take, the dream that we had and really run with it and make it something that is tangible, right? Because at the end of the day, like, no, you can't touch it, but the idea is something that you can feel and you can see it, right? And so, like, I think the biggest art and the biggest piece of advice, or even if not that you really asked for advice, but for people who are
it's
listening,
good. I'm sure somebody wants to hear it for sure.
Yeah, the biggest piece of advice is like if you can find a way to, for your intended audience to hear the information that you want and receive it in the way that they can understand it, like you'll go so many different places, right? Like that's the biggest hurdle, right? People that don't understand blockchain, like why does it need to exist? Answer that question for them in your pitch, right? Like people that understand, like, why do I care about, hanging out with, XYZ celebrity? Explain to them that there are people that do. Prove to them why, right? Like that's the biggest thing, right? And so once you're able to answer those questions, and lastly, to your point too, is like, real estate's a bit different because you can obviously see the opportunity a little bit more because it's like right in front of you. But, a lot of times that by the time people see the vision that you're talking about, it's too late to make that crazy return, right? So like, as an investor, you got to take those bets. And I think people are starting to realize that. And so, with the market, being where it is, and some people are taking more risk and stuff like that, rates are super low. And so like in terms of raising capital at this point in time, finding that extra, yield creation, that wealth creation, that extra, return on an investment at this point in time, you got to take that risk just right now based off of where rates are. So I think those are the tailwinds. But again, like the biggest piece is everybody's got to be a great salesperson. And you got to be able to answer the questions that these people are looking to, have answers to.
Yeah, no, that's a is and another thing that I was thinking about in this conversation, or it came up in the conversation I was having with my good buddy, was he was like, you got to understand that these people have the capital anyway, and they have to deploy it somewhere. When you,
Hmm.
especially when you start talking about accredited investors, right? So once they can see it, and they're looking for ideas to be able to, just like you said, to get those returns, but you just got to be able to answer the question of why does this need to exist? And I think that that's
Exactly.
something that's very small but very powerful. And we never think about that. We don't even ask our question. We don't even ask ourselves that question in the beginning. We just have an
Yeah.
idea and we're like, oh, this would be really cool. But like, why does this need to exist? Because, like
Yep.
you said, there's Cameo, there's a lot of other things already, right? But how can you be the centralized platform? And it is absolutely crazy to think that one day we could be buying a piece of LeBron or Steph Curry or something like that.
Absolutely.
Like it's
Absolutely. It's crazy, but like things too, right? Like it was crazy a year ago thinking that people would be paying absurd thousands, tens of $1,000s for digital art, like NFTs, right? But people are doing it, right? Like, and that's kind of like what we're saying here. And like we've been in the space long enough to be blessed to see the evolution of that product. But tokenizing things are what people are doing. But our bet is that we're going to tokenize people, and we think that's what's going to be next, right? And so like NFTs, the boom happened, and the market's still pretty hot. But I think that next market is going to be kind of tokenizing people, and the intertwining of those two things is going to be very interesting. So that's what we're really excited about here at Galaxy.
No, that's super dope, and we're definitely gonna jump back into Galaxy. But the one last question I have on this is: when people are investing in, like, do you go after your family and friends, or because you know that there's so much of a risk, right, that like they could
That's a
lose
great
on this
question.
thing, that you're like, I like to stay away from them. I like to go accredited investors that I don't really know. It's just black and
It
white.
is it is a great question because it does because from my previous life there's a lot of people that wanted to support me in my vision and ultimately they did. But it was never something that I really fully extended to myself out to them because it's tough. Like I think for me like as a founder and anybody that's a founder that their validating point is I believe in your idea. That's worth more to me from somebody that I know than investing dollars on some days. Not every
Right.
day, but some days, that having that validation is super, super important. And so, like, for me, a lot of the people that reach out, like, how do I invest in this and stuff, I kind of was like, yeah, I appreciate it. Like, I appreciate it. Thankfully, we've been in a situation where we've been able to raise money so we don't need your contribution. But people were like, I actually want this wealth creation. Like, you're going to hold out on me. And it's like, okay, like, if that's what you want, like, for sure. And so, like, I think it's a very interesting thing. But, also, at the same time, like, we just have so much, this is such a community movement here that we have. Like we're doing this with 100 plus of our friends that are creators that are looking to solve the same issue with us on this journey. So we've gotten participation from, some of those higher net worth ones as well. And so, yeah, like, it was never the thing that when we started raising money, we're going to go reach out to our closest friends and family to start. But, ultimately they wanted to join the journey with us. And, we were able to make that work. But it's a very interesting question that you ask because it is tough. You don't want to, it's a tough, balance to really find, trying to raise capital and raise as much as possible, but at the same time, not really, dig too much in your own pockets or your pockets or networks.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And so when you're having these conversations, did it ever come up that yes, you could lose money, or because you're dealing with a lot of high net worth accredited individuals, they kind of already know, they just read over the contract and it is what it is.
Yeah, I mean, I think everybody really knows, and especially in the regulatory environment that we are in now, like the idea of consumer protection is really big in the eyes of the SEC and different governing bodies, right? So all the docs that we have are super, very, very upfront and clear that this is a speculative investment. Like, be prepared to understand that this is not something that is guaranteed to make you money or anything like that. That's kind of those things, and so I think a lot of the people that we've dealt with, predominantly they are accredited investors. So I think from that perspective, we didn't really have to answer that question a lot. But it certainly is one of those things where, like, especially the people that know you, like they ask you very quite frankly, like, what do you really think? Like, what do you think, in your gut and heart and soul? And it's like tough to not to, like, to the moon all the time, every
Right.
single time. But yeah, no, I think from that perspective, people don't really ask those questions because, the documents are usually pretty, forthcoming about that, and we are as well. But we've been lucky enough to have great support the entire way.
That's what's up, man. So Galaxy, back onto it. What's the vision in the next 3 years? Like, where do you guys want this thing to go? Where do you see it going?
Yeah, I would say that we want to be synonymous with the idea of personal monetization. Like, we want to be the standard, we want to be the vanguard, we want to be the guys in the room that are viewed at the guys helping the entertainment industry and entertainers themselves monetize themselves to the full capacity. And that's for every single type of creator. So whether you're an NBA player, an NFL player, or you're an Instagram influencer, or you're a TikToker, we want all of those people to think about Galaxy as the one-stop shop for them in their personal monetization. I think in terms of the product aspect of it, like I said before, the social media aspects of it are super important. But ultimately, we want to be known as a gateway product into the decentralized future. If we could be known as those guys that helped demystify blockchain and apply it in a way that made sense and was really cool to the average person where they started learning and using the technology, that'd be great. Like, I think the people that we look up to, and me in particular, is like, you think about those companies like Apple, you think about those companies like Tesla, supremely capable, great technology that you don't have to know how it works, but it just does. Ultimately at the end of the day, like, that's what sells, and that's what's super important. That's what life changing is, right? The idea of Uber and how they changed the way that we think about stuff, right? Like, thinking about it this way, right? Like, there was a time that, like, when it was 2 a.m. and there was no cars around, no taxis, like, or public transportation, you were fresh out of luck. Like, you couldn't get out where you were going next. Like, you were just stuck waiting until somebody was around. But Uber told us you didn't have to live that way, right? And the same thing with blockchain. Like, I went to go buy a car as soon as I moved to Los Angeles. I moved here about a month and a half ago. Just a full tilt Galaxy and all that stuff. And I went to the bank to get the cashier's check for the down payment, and it was closed. And that was it. The bank was closed. So I had to wait until the next day to go out and get the money to give to the dealership. But there's technology out there where you can send that type of money as fast as a text message. It's far more secure and much quicker, right? So I know that. And so, like, for me, it's the craziest thing in the world. But the thing is, we as a society, like, when the bank was closed, it was closed when your grandma went. It was closed when your grandma's grandma went, right? Like, it was just closed. But, ultimately what we're starting to see is people are starting to change that consumer behavior and start asking those questions about whether it needs to be that way or not. And so from my perspective, it's like, if we could be known as those guys that help change the way that we think, and you start changing a generation in the way that people, live their lives, ultimately more impactful than any amount of dollars and zeros. Obviously that stuff comes with it, but that's the idea of being, true visionaries.
Yeah, no, man, that's a solid explanation. And I love what you said. Like, we want to be the personal vanguard, right? Because that's the standard, right? We want to be, and it's something that I think any big thought leader, any big dreamer, they can understand that, and the persistence and the resiliency that you've already went through and that you'll continue to go through. It's definitely admirable, because obviously we all got a dream. And so the fact that you've stayed on this dream, and now you're just putting in more work behind it lets everyone know that it's only a matter of time. And just like you said, being blockchain, when you think about things like that, that is an inconvenience, right? Going to the bank and it's not open, or, whatever it might be. Think about even, on a smaller scale, how convenient Venmo and Cash App and things like that have become for us, right? I know we were just down in Nationals for basketball for my son, and we got to the place and it was like out in the middle of nowhere, but long story short, they didn't have an ATM or anything, and they only took cash. And so then my wife was like, hey, can we just Venmo you? And the guy was like, yeah, that's fine, and I'll give it. But 5 years ago, we wouldn't have been able to do that, or maybe 7 years ago. And now you would have had to wait on somebody to come through the door that could borrow you some cash.
No, exactly. It's crazy how, like, the world changes over time, and we have these technological advances that, push our thinking in the envelope a little further. And, it's kind of crazy. Like, ultimately, I remember when Bluetooth was a thing. Like, I was a kid and Bluetooth came around, and people were like, this is weird. Like, why do people, like, I got AirPods in, but, like, 10 years ago when people had those, like, earpieces, I was like, dude, you look like such a nerd. Like, that's so weird. But, like, now that it's commonplace, and that's just, how it is. And so I think, ultimately that's what any founder, really wants to do, to try to change the world. But, that's ultimately what we could hopefully try and, start, over here on Galaxy.
Yeah. Let me ask you, and this is something that you mentioned earlier. You said, I've been blessed to have great mentors Obviously, you got a great co-founder, but now that you're gaining a lot of traction and you have competitors out there, is it easy to reach out to people who, when you say like a Cameo or something, are those people receptive of you? Is there like a founder network, or do you find that you have to go find people that are maybe outside of your niche or your industry, but just understand what it's like to be a visionary to maybe help you?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a combination of both. Like, I've been blessed to, have great, mentors throughout my entire adult life. Ended up on Wall Street because of it, and actually, ultimately, in a lot of ways, like, your founder, your founders, like your co-founder, could be a mentor. Like, Hunter's a mentor to me in, certain aspects of this whole journey as well. Like, he taught me about blockchain. I taught him about finance, but he taught me about blockchain. And so I think from that perspective, that was key. And going back to what you're saying about the, founders network, I think, yeah, absolutely. Like in your space, especially in crypto and blockchain, it's a very, very niche space at this moment in time. And so I think from that perspective, we've benefited a lot from people wanting to look out for each other in the community because we're all pioneers in the space, right? Like we're all early to the space. It's not the space, not the earliest to the space because crypto's been around for 10 years, don't get it twisted. But we're still relatively early in the whole product life cycle and adoption of, the technology. And so people are very open, and the whole nature and ethos about, blockchain technology, it being open source in a lot of situations is, collaboration. So we have great partners, and the whole network there is just how can we work better together, versus working against each other or better, separately. So I think that's kind of like how we've been able to, end up with a lot of great supporters for our project.
That's what's up, man. For as wise as you are now, and especially over these last 3 years, everything that you've learned on Galaxy, I always like to ask the question if there's anything that you would change. But when I ask that question, the uniform answer that I seem to get is people say I wouldn't change anything because it's made me who I
Yeah.
am. And it's like, yep,
Yeah.
I understand. Even though I call a little bit of BS, and we would all change something, but I've
Yeah.
learned how to phrase this in a different way. So if there was one thing, knowing everything that you know now, if there was one thing that you wish that you would have implemented sooner to accelerate your path on your dream and where you are, at least so far today, what would that one thing be?
I think it took a little bit longer than I would have liked to realize that I was just, not all that happy doing my previous job, like taking a risk and doing stuff and just really, at the end of the day, people will always tell you, you would be great at this. And like I said, we live in a society where we just love, being validated by others. And so I think for that perspective, I knew for a long time that I didn't want to, didn't want to be in that life. But for a lot of reasons, whether I felt like it wasn't the right time, whether I felt like I just needed a little bit more time, like, I needed to jump out, pull the parachute, and hopefully it opened. And so, like that kind of was something that I wish I would have done a lot earlier, just believing in my own, vision and my own, belief in my own self, to ultimately take that next step. And so that's kind of the one thing I wish I would have done sooner is just, really listening to myself. And instead of, being fixated on what other people might have been saying or what other people said I should have been doing.
Love it, man. Thank you for sharing that. I want to be the first one, if nobody else has told you today, to say thank you. And I appreciate you, my brother, for coming on and blessing the show. We'll make sure that we put all of the links to Galaxy and everything else that you have going on in the show notes. But for anybody who wants to stay directly connected with you, tell us, where can we find you at?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I appreciate you having me on the show. Definitely would love to connect with anyone that's interested, whether it's finance, whether it's blockchain, whether it's about being African, whatever it is, being Black, we'd love to have the conversation. But yeah, no, I'm pretty active on social. You can find me on Twitter at Solo Ceesay, SOLOCEESAY. You can find me on Instagram at solo.ceesay. And find me on LinkedIn and all other platforms as well. But, obviously would love and welcome any more conversations. But appreciate you having me on the show. It's been great.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, just as he said, Dream Nation, We all know that we all have a dream, but if you don't take action on it, if you don't truly just believe in yourself, and hopefully this story shows you that anything is possible, right? If you have integrity, if you have a dream and you're willing to, jump out and just pull the parachute and pray. If you got to bet on something, and we all are betting on something or someone, right? If you got a job, you're betting on that boss or that organization. So if you got to bet on something or someone anyway, why not bet on yourself? But more importantly, you got to take action. That's all for this one. We'll catch you on the next one. That's all we got for this episode. Thank you for sticking around. That truly means a lot to me, and hopefully that means that we delivered massive value on this one. If you haven't already, the way that you could say thank you to myself and the team is just by heading over to iTunes and leaving a review and a rating. That's what iTunes loves to see. That's how we get out there even more, and I would definitely be grateful for it. I know the team would as well. Do me a favor and head on over to DREAMNationPodcast.com. That's where you're going to be able to find all of the resources that we talked about in today's episode, as well as more exclusive content. And you'll also be able to sign up to our email list where we have more exclusive content. And we always love to hear the feedback from you all because you're our tribe. So remember, in the dream we trust, we'll see you on the flip side.